Alright, this is Angela Shi, and I'm just going to be going over the feedback loops in the non-gravid female reproductive system. Okay, first I wanted to go over both the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. They each have 3 different phases, and each phase kind of corresponds to the other one. So for the ovarian cycle, the follicular phase is composed of follicular growth. So the follicle is basically a little container for the oocyte, which is the female egg. And then from the follicular phase, it goes into ovulation, which is the release of the oocyte from the follicle, into the uterus for fertilization and ultimately pregnancy. And then from ovulation, it goes into the luteal phase, where that ruptured follicle that just released the egg turns into the corpus luteum, which secretes progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin, and then later dies within that same cycle. And after the luteal phase, it'll go right back into the follicular phase, as it is a cycle. So for the uterine cycle, it starts off with menses, which is the shedding of endometrial lining and bleeding from the uterus, also commonly known as the female period. And then from there it goes into the proliferative phase, which is the addition of a layer of cells in the uterus for pregnancy and preparation of pregnancy. So that's the thickening of that endometrial lining. And then from the proliferative phase, it goes into the secretory phase, where the endometrium becomes a secretory structure. And the same thing with the ovarian cycle. So after the secretory phase, it goes right back into menses, as it is a cycle. And this is just a couple of graphs that show how each phase of the uterine and the ovarian cycle correspond to each other. So this chart on the right here shows, so for the ovarian cycle, you have the follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase. And then for the uterine cycle, you have the period, or the menses, the proliferative phase, and then the secretory phase. And so the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle corresponds with the menses and the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle, and then ovulation occurs, and then the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle corresponds with the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. So this graph on the left here, it kind of shows how the different hormones and everything, the release of the different hormones corresponds to each phase of the ovarian cycle here, and then the uterine cycle here. So the main things to note are the spikes in LH right before ovulation, and FSH as well, but mainly LH. And then the peak in estrogen in the follicular phase, or the proliferative phase for the uterine cycle, and then the peak in progesterone in the luteal/secretory phase. And I'll go through why all of this happens in a little bit. So starting with the early to mid follicular phase, in the beginning, FSH and LH are increased. So this leads to, beginning with the production of the increased FSH. So the increased FSH goes into the granulosa cells, where it promotes the release of AMH and estrogen. So AMH is the anti-Müllerian hormone, which prevents the recruitment of additional follicles by reducing the follicle sensitivity to FSH. And the increase in estrogen. So estrogen has a negative feedback effect on GnRH, FSH, and LH. But it has a positive feedback on the granulosa cells. And if you were to follow the path of LH after it's released from the pituitary gland, and after it's prompted for release by the GnRH from the hypothalamus, so the LH would go into the fecal cells, where it will prompt the release of androgens, which then go into the granulosa cells and are converted into estrogen by aromatase. So the main goal here is really just to increase levels of estrogen. So despite the negative feedback effect that estrogen has on FSH and LH, it's still able to increase in terms of how much is being produced by the positive feedback that it has on granulosa cells. So all of these feedback loops combined together really are just trying to increase the estrogen levels. And then in the late follicular phase and into the ovulation, there's increased estrogen, like I said, but it still has the negative feedback on FSH, but the previously negative feedback effect that it had on GnRH is actually turned into a positive feedback loop. So it promotes the release of GnRH. And from there, the granulosa cells also produce progesterone, which has a positive effect on GnRH, the positive feedback effect on GnRH and LH. So all of this is just trying to induce the LH surge, which resumes meiosis in oocytes and readies the follicle to release the egg. So it's really readying the egg for ovulation. So the positive feedback of estrogen on GnRH and the positive feedback effect of progesterone on both GnRH and LH increase LH levels, which causes the LH surge and helps with ovulation. So there's mainly the LH surge that we're concerned about, but FSH surges as well. It's just being inhibited by inhibin from the granulosa cells, which has a negative feedback effect on FSH. So you'll see a slight increase in FSH as well, but it won't be as marked as the increase in LH. And in terms of what the uterus is doing at this point, it's the endometrium is thickening in preparation for pregnancy, and then after the follicular phase ends, the ovulation occurs. So the egg is released from the follicle, and prostaglandins are produced in order to aid in that release. And then we have the early to mid luteal phase. So this is where the corpus luteum is formed. So it's formed from the remains of the follicle after the egg has been released. The corpus luteum secretes estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin, but it mainly secretes a large amount of progesterone. So the three hormones that the corpus luteum produces have a negative feedback effect on GnRH, FSH, and LH, and this is mainly just to prevent the formation of another follicle while the egg is awaiting fertilization in the uterus. And then we arrive at the late luteal phase, where the corpus luteum ends up dying. So the corpus luteum only has a lifespan of a few days, but when it can no longer sustain itself, it dies, and after it dies, it can no longer produce estrogen and progesterone, so the levels of estrogen and progesterone decrease, and this decrease in those hormones removes the negative feedback on FSH and LH. So it's no longer decreasing the production of FSH and LH through negative feedback. So FSH and LH end up increasing, and so the cycle will restart at the follicular phase. So at this point in time, the thickened endometrium comes off in terms of what the uterus is doing, and menstruation ends up occurring as well. So after the cycle restarts. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.